Welcome today to a rational, reasonable discussion of the likelihood of Nintendo Directs in 2021. Let me begin.
We're already awakened to the year where are the directs. Just Nintendo, not care at all.
Let's talk about it. But okay, for real, this will be a super chill discussion about Nintendo Directs. The root of the question is simple. 2020 was a historically unprecedented year, and Nintendo seemingly had to pivot in their marketing strategy. This means that we went the whole year without what we refer to commonly as a general Nintendo Direct. Nintendo was actually asked about this a few times throughout the year, and we've gotten some quotes from them that are pretty basic PR talk about it now. So the question is, now that 2020 is over and times are potentially more precedented, do we expect Nintendo to return to form like the first 3 years of the Switch, even though they weren't entirely uniform, to be honest? Or do we think they've settled on the new makeshift strategies they came up with in 2020? Or lastly, are they still workshopping what's the best method and they'll keep changing stuff up for months or years to come? Really, that's the question. And for a bit of personal opinion first, I will say I personally enjoy Directs. I try to keep expectations pretty low every time, so that helps me not be too disappointed. And I also tend to watch them on behalf of the Switch community perspective, not really just my own. So a presentation with 30 games and only one of them is something I'd personally be interested, I try to gauge how significant the other announcements are for their respective fandoms. Like, I wouldn't care that much about Splatoon 3 for me personally, but it would be a hype announcement because I know it's a huge deal for Splatoon fans. So I'd come out of that Direct still pretty excited, even if not on my own behalf. Feel free to employ my curated techniques to ensure that you too can enjoy just about every Direct. But even despite liking these presentations, the real core of it is obviously the surprise in the games. And if there's a different way to announce all of those same exact games that somehow spreads the word even wider or means that I hear about some that I may have overlooked in a whole Direct, then I'm here for it. Basically, what I'm saying is I enjoy Directs and I'd prefer to keep them, but it's really the content that matters, not the context. So if they go away but the games keep coming, so be it. But are they gonna go away? Well, let's define what all kind of Directs there are, because I think the simple answer is that no matter what, there will absolutely be things within the Nintendo Direct family in 2021 and moving forward, but whether it's a general Direct or not might be its own question. So there's general Directs, which typically means it's 35 to 45 minutes, has at least one or two big first-party announcements, and these historically have happened up to 3 times a year. One between January and March, one around E3, and one around September. This is what we didn't have any of in 2020. Next are Nintendo Direct Minis. Long story short, they're basically the same, but closer to 15 to 25 minutes, and the whole format has ebbed and flowed from streaming the presentation to dropping it all online for people to watch to multiple trailers separated out, but the key thing being that Nintendo published games are still featured somewhere. On the other hand is what made its first appearance last year, Nintendo Direct Mini Partner Showcase. It's a super long name, but basically it's as short as 8 minutes to as long as 20 so far, and these are the same format as a Direct, but only focused on third-party titles. And we'll get into more detail on that later. And lastly are game or franchise-specific Directs like for Smash or Animal Crossing or whatever, and Indie World Showcases, which is a mini Direct just with indie games. So that's all of them, and for a while that was basically the only way Nintendo was announcing games outside of events like the Game Awards or something like that. But last year, there were more new additions to the roster of Nintendo PR events, standalone Nintendo Treehouses for Paper Mario, Pikmin 3 Deluxe, and Age of Calamity, and regular old tweets, just dropping a trailer on YouTube and tweeting it out on good old twitter.com. So all of that. Honestly, it's a lot of ways to get out information about games by Nintendo and upcoming games on the Nintendo Switch that they want to highlight. And about midway through last year, when asked at their investors briefing what their plans were with Directs, Nintendo President Furukawa answered, "We feel Nintendo Directs are an incredibly effective way to present information directly to our customers in a very straightforward way. Inversely, times change, and so do the most effective way to promote products. So there is a chance that a new, better way to present this information comes about. So we always like to examine all of the possible ways to communicate this information to customers." And here is that crux that we started with. Have they found more effective ways, and are they done searching? To them, was the Twitter drop, one first-party game at a time, a more effective method of communicating than the Direct ever was? AJ actually made a video about this kind of thing thing last fall. One of his points was that if you just look at the view count on a full direct as compared to an announcement trailer for Paper Mario and the Origami King, for example, it would actually be skewed more often than not in favor of the standalone announcement. As of today, the September direct as a whole from 2019 has 2.6 million views, whereas the Origami King trailer has 5.7. Of course, this partly has to do with the fact that a single trailer is far more rewatchable and shareable, and generally has a much longer shelf life than a whole direct. But if Nintendo is just looking at those plain numbers, that's certainly a factor. One more similar statistic is that the March 2018 direct that announced Smash Ultimate has 4.2 million views, and that exact trailer, separate from the direct, has 5.9 million views. And to me, what's interesting here is that a franchise as storied and popular as Smash has such close view count to a comparatively niche game, Paper Mario, with 2 whole years between them. So does Nintendo see this information and decide that, like a band releasing singles, they're more likely to get eyes on each separate product if split up than as a whole collection where some get forgotten or swept under the rug? And in my opinion, they certainly could. I don't think they do. No matter what, the directs that will keep going, if only these, would be the Indie World showcases and partner directs. Of course, the first 2 partner directs of last year were pretty pitiful, but the one with Monster Hunter Rise and Stories 2 showed that it's just a formula and needs to have good content. And as long as they have enough third-party games to fill those out, the format works fine. But I just think it's so valuable for Nintendo to show off more games than just the ones they publish, and some kind of presentation with a wide portfolio is way more likely to give that impression than just tweeting about new games every once in a while. In the same way that people might think of PlayStation when they think of Destiny 2, or think Xbox when they think Call of Duty. I don't know, I'm just guessing at those. Nintendo wants to make sure that they hold the marketing for lots of indies and specific third parties that fit their MO. So the partner showcases are a great way to capitalize on those relationships with other publishers and make sure it's known that those games are at home on Switch. But I think the return of General Directs also is a big part of that conversation. A new mainline Monster Hunter game is certainly one game that can hold up a partner showcase pretty well, but there just isn't always one huge third-party game that will. Oftentimes the Switch gets ports of big, older games or smaller third parties, with a couple really significant ones here and there, but as we saw with the first 2 partner showcases, if there isn't significant content holding the whole thing up, even a bunch of decent announcements can come across as a disappointment to the viewer base, which leads me to the conclusion that it may be a net even for Nintendo to show off their first-party games in a direct versus a standalone announcement, but I think they're aware of the positive impact that they can have on the platform as a whole. So if it's between going back to directs, even if more sporadically for whatever reason, or a combo of Twitter drops plus partner showcases, I'm tempted to think that the directs prove to still be more effective for the ecosystem. Additionally, and I mentioned this on our podcast last week, if I'm ever in a position like Nintendo's, where I do something one way, but find another possible method that has promise, even if that new way seems a bit better, I'll at least try the original way again to check if it really is worse, or maybe there were just some other factors at play, you know? So as Nintendo, I would at least try one more good Nintendo Direct, even if I thought Twitter drops were better. Again, it's still possible that there's yet more ideas that they're gonna try, and I can't really fathom a guess as to what those would be. But now that we're out of the more investigative side of this video, let me just give my opinions on what I personally predict for Directs this year. Honestly, I still expect that we'll see a mixture of Directs, but still some standalone announcements. I think these Twitter drops from Nintendo especially benefit the titles of theirs that they believe most likely to be buried in the mix. So a new Yoshi game, or a port of a Wii U game, anything that on its own is a bit more of a niche experience, which most of Nintendo's 2020 announcements were. That said, I still expect 2, maybe even 3 Directs this year, but each of them will likely only have 2 first-party announcements, one to open and one to close as their one more thing. The tricky question this year is knowing just how many anniversaries there are, how do they handle each of those? To be honest, this may be the biggest argument against Directs. If Zelda has a 35th anniversary video like Mario did, then that's 4 or 5 announcements that aren't in a Direct. So then if Metroid could also potentially have something, and Pokemon, and so on, soon soon the year is just filled with anniversary directs and partner showcases. I don't honestly expect that, but probably for at least Zelda, I'd guess that would be the case. But as for specific and immediate predictions, Super Mario 3D World plus Bowser's Fury is one of two big factors. Do we see a direct before it, detailing Bowser's Fury, or after, once the game is out? Going off of precedent, I'm actually gonna guess after. I suspect a Nintendo Treehouse in late January showing off a little bit of that content, and the game launches, and then the week after we get a big direct. The other factor that could actually come about in that very show is the rumored Switch Pro. If it is coming out closer to the beginning of the year, then that would absolutely be a place to show it. Of course, this is all speculative, but most importantly, it's also all okay if it literally goes the opposite of everything I've guessed here. AJ and I will absolutely argue about all of this on this weekend's podcast, but I think one of the things that makes Directs feel less likely and a little more gross is really just the fact that a sector of the Switch fanbase really does get their expectations so very high that nothing can barely satisfy it. And then there's always a slew of bad press after that. And so many people whine when we don't get one for a while. And the truth of the matter is that it's really no big deal at all if we get any or not. I agree, they're super fun. I like them a lot and I hope they return, but they're not the end of the world. But also, let me remind you,
We're already awakened to the year. We are the direct. Just pretend you not care at all.
but that's what I think. What do you think? Do you think we're going to see Nintendo Directs this year, or do you think Nintendo's going back to what they did last year, or again, that third possible option of doing something entirely different? What ideas do you have for that? Let me know all that and more in the comments section down below. And while you're down there, be sure to like the video and subscribe to fanatixfour for more content like this every Tuesday and Thursday from me and AJ. And some of those comments you leave down there, we'll pull those and talk about them on our podcast this weekend. And you can go check that out at youtube.com/directly2you or on all podcast services and all that stuff. It's a great old time. We very much enjoy the podcast and so on. But that's about it for me. Peace and blessings.